Hi, Grade 4. Today I'm going to be reading you Chapter 14 of The People of Sparks. It is called What Torren Did. All day, after Casper and Maddie left, Mrs. Mordeau wondered where Lena was. Had the doctor sent her on an errand? She asked, but the answer was no. Did Torren know where she was? He said he didn't know and didn't care. Thinking maybe Lena had gone to the Pioneer Hotel to see Dune, Mrs. Mordeau walked down there, but no one had seen her. By evening, when Lena was still missing, Mrs. Mordeau was very worried. She found the note in her book that night. She frowned as she read it. This didn't seem like a good idea to her. It was one of Lena's rash, impulsive acts and probably was dangerous. Mrs. Mordeau went downstairs, knocked on the doctor's door, and showed her the note. "Can we send someone after her?" she said, "to bring her back?" But the doctor shook her head. "They're a whole day ahead," she said. "No one could catch up, even if you could find someone willing to go." So Mrs. Mordeau went back to bed and tried to sleep. She told herself that Lena had survived many dangers before, but she still lay awake worrying most of the night. In the morning at breakfast, Torren asked where Lena was, and Mrs. Mordeau told him. He jumped out of his chair and threw down his piece of bread, which bounced on the table. "She went with them?" he cried. "She went with Casper?" "Calm down," said Miss Dr. Hester. "No," yelled Torren. "I won't calm down. I hate her. I hate all of you cave people. Why did you have to come here and ruin everything?" With a furious swipe of his hand, he knocked over Mrs. Mordeau's cup of tea. He kicked backwards his chair, which fell over, and he ran out of the room. Through the window, Mrs. Mordeau saw him racing across the courtyard and out the gate. "Jealous," said the doctor. "He wants Casper all to himself. Heaven knows why." "That boy craves attention," said Mrs. Mordeau. "I doubt that he cares who it's from." "I suppose you're right," said the doctor, looking at Miss Mordeau with faint surprise. Torren sped down the river road, full of boiling rage. He was the one who should be sitting beside Casper, not that fat Maddie, not that silly cave girl. He should be there riding the truck, going away to be a roamer, but she had snuck off and done it instead. He hated her for it. It was the worst thing that had happened to him in his whole life. He ran a long way, his feet pounding the dusty road, his fists pumping back and forth. Furious tears streaming down his face. When he stopped panting, he was way out in the tomato field not far from the wind tower, where he had been the day the cave people came over the hill. He remembered how they'd looked, like a swarm of horrible insects coming down toward the village. Now the cave people had settled in as if they were going to stay forever. They were eating food that should belong to the people of Sparks. They were wearing clothes that Sparks people had given them. They walked around the streets of Sparks as if they belonged here. Torren wanted them gone. He stomped among the tomato plants, throwing punches at the air. "Get out of here! Get out!" he cried, as if Lena and all the Emberites were there to hear him. His thoughts were like flames inside his head. He kept seeing Casper on the seat of his truck with Maddie on one side and Lena on the other. The feeling that went with his picture was like a sharp stick in his stomach. If only he had one of those giant bombs they had in the old days. He imagined they were about the size of watermelons. He would shoot one at Lena. It would sail halfway into the city and drop right on Casper's truck and blow them all up. Then he would throw another one to the Pioneer Hotel. It would flatten the building. He longed to throw that big bomb. He could almost feel it in his hands. He'd come out at the end of the row of plants, where a small, whitewashed storage shed stood at the end of the field. Crates of tomatoes were stacked nearby, ready to be distributed. Without thinking, Torren grabbed a tomato from the nearest crate and hurled it against the wall of the shed. It splattered. Red water dripped down the white wall. It felt so good to do this that he did it again. In a fury, he snatched up one tomato after another. Wham! 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 He flung them with all of his might until the windows of the shed splintered and the wall was a mess, and a long mound of broken red flesh lay on the ground. He stopped and took a breath. What would the farmers think if they saw this? 2 whole crates of tomatoes smashed? They'd be angry, but they wouldn't know who done it, would they? No one had seen him. And that's when the idea floated into Torren's mind, a really exciting idea. He smiled, thinking about it. He threw one last tomato, aiming for the dark glass tooth holes of the broken window. There was a satisfying crash as the tomato knocked something over inside. Torren turned and ran, but he didn't go all the way home. When Dune came through the town that morning on his way to work, he found Mrs. Mordeau waiting for him by the side of the road. She signaled to him with one finger, and he left the stream of workers and came over to her. "Lena has gone off," she said. "I thought you should know." "Gone off? Gone where?" Mrs. Mordeau produced a scrap piece of paper from the pocket of her skirt. "Read this," she said. Dune read. He scrunched up his nose in puzzlement. He remembered Lena telling him something the other day about these people, Caspar and Maddie. Was that what she had said? He tried to recall. He looked again at the note. "Something important," she said. "What could that be?" Mrs. Mordeau shrugged her thin shoulders. "She gets ideas in her head," she said. Dune could see that she was worried, though she didn't say so. "Well, she says she'll be back in 2 or 3 days," said Dune. "That's not so long." "The thing is," said Mrs. Mordeau, "that Caspar left. When he left, he wouldn't be back for several months." Dune frowned. What was Lena up to? He didn't understand it, but he didn't want to make Mrs. Mordeau more worried than she was. "She must have a plan for getting back," he said, handing back the note. "Of course," said Mrs. Mordeau briskly. She folded the note and replaced it in her pocket. "There's no need to worry. I'll have her come by and find you as soon as she returns." She headed back towards the doctor's house, and Dune went towards the fields. He walked slowly to give himself time to think. He was upset about Lena. How could she be so foolish as to launch herself into an unknown world with 2 unknown people? But in a way he wasn't surprised. Lena was always eager to investigate new places. Look how she'd gone up to the roof of the gathering hall on the first day. She became a messenger in Ember. Look how eager she'd been to go down into the pipeworks. She probably just wanted to see what was outside of Sparks. As soon as she'd satisfied her curiosity, she'd be back. But Dune was upset about Lena for another reason, too. And it didn't have to do with her safety. He was upset that she'd gone exploring without him. All through the last days of Ember, they'd been partners. Now she was off on her own, leaving him here. He was annoyed, and he was hurt. He had to admit to himself that he hadn't been a very good friend to Lena lately. Maybe he'd hurt her feelings by paying so much attention to Tick. But still, it was Lena who was his partner in important things. If she had an important reason for hitching a ride with Caspar, why hadn't she told him? Why hadn't she asked him to come along? He trudged towards the tomato field, head down, scuffing his shoes irritably in the dust. And so he didn't notice until he was right up to it that a commotion was going on by the storage shed. Everyone was crowded around, and Chugger, the team leader, was yelling. Dune hurried towards them to see what was going on. "Wasted, wasted!" Chugger was shouting. 2 whole crates smashed! Who's done this? And the shed plastered with muck and the window broken? He glared at the crowd of workers. "Any of you know about this?" he demanded. "Anyone know what mad person did this?" No one said a word. Dune stared with horror at the mess on the wall. He could feel the rage of the person who had done it. "I don't like this," said Chugger darkly. "Nothing like this ever happened before you people arrived. I want it cleaned right away. Walls washed, windows fixed, mess cleared away. Get on it." "Listen," said someone. Dune turned to see who it was, and it was Tick speaking. "We didn't do this." "Don't get all tough with us." Chugger whipped around. "Who else would do it? Who else but one of you, always griping and grumbling?" "But we only just got here now. How could we have done it?" someone called out. "Besides, we wouldn't," cried someone. "We would never waste food." More and more voices rose in protest. Dune added his two, saying, "It wasn't us. It couldn't have been." But Chugger just stood and scowled at them. Finally he yelled, "Quiet! Get to work!" Just after that, Dune heard running footsteps behind him and turned to see Torren racing across the field. He was shouting in his shrill, high voice as he came. "I saw!" he cried, waving his arms. "Last night I was out here and I saw!" He ran into the midst of the workers and stood panting, his little eyes wild. "I heard a thump, 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 so I snuck up to see. And I did see." "Well then," said Chugger, "what did you see?" "I saw who threw the tomatoes. I saw who made that big mess and broke the window." He stood with his neck poked forward and his skinny arms held tight to his sides. His whole body was trembling with excitement. His eyes scanned the group of workers. "It was him!" he shrieked, pointing to Dune. "It was him that did it. I saw him." Dune was so shocked that he couldn't make a sound. He stood with his mouth open, staring at Torren. Around him a few people spoke up. "He did not," said someone. "He couldn't have." Anyway, he wouldn't. No, said someone, he would never do that. But Chugger seized his arm and pulled him roughly aside. What do you have to say for yourself? Is this your doing? Dune shook his head. No, that boy is lying. And why would he do that? Why would he take the trouble to come out here first thing in the morning to point to you and lie? I don't know, said Dune. Chugger released his arm with a push. I'll keep a special eye on you from now on, he said. But why? Said Dune. I didn't do this. How do I know that? Said Chugger. It's your word against his, and he's one of us. End of chapter 14.